from Montclair Design Week and Radio Free Montclair. And each day this week, we've taken questions from people in the community about things they've always wondered about the place they live. And we've tracked down some folks to help provide answers. Welcome to our Friday show, the last in our series. I'm Scott Gurian. And when I'm not hosting Please Explain, I'm a journalist and I travel around the world reporting interesting stories for my podcast, which is called Far From Home. But that's, of course, a bit hard to do right now in the middle of a global pandemic. So I just got to thinking that there's actually really fascinating stories all around us, right, in our communities. We don't really have to go very far. So that was kind of the thinking behind this show. And each day this week, I've been joined by a different co-host and different guests. My co-host for today is Rich too. Rich, welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Scott, for having me. And also that was a great intro. And also thank you to everyone at Montclair Design Week. And also Please Explain. So my name is Rich too. I'm a designer. I'm an artist myself. Also, I'm the vice president of digital design over at MTV, over at ViacomCBS. And also, if you're wondering why I'm here, I designed the mural at Ani Ramen on Bloomfield Ave. Shout out to the Ani Ramen fam and also Montclair for being the home to that first location. And also I was born and raised in New Jersey. Currently live in Brooklyn, but Jersey is always in my heart and I go back as often as possible.
Awesome. Well, we're so glad to have you with us today and looking forward to this conversation. Actually, our first question asker today is Iain, who lives in Montclair, and he has some questions and concerns about the environment. So welcome, Iain. Thanks for joining us. And what's the question you wanted to ask?
Hey, Scott and Rich, it's great to see you. Well, this week we had, earlier in the week, we had this program on race and ecology with Prakash Kashwan. And one of the issues that came up was how problematic it is to see that humans are not part of nature and that this pristine myth is racially loaded. And Prakash challenged all of us to decolonize environmentalism. We got a lot of questions about this in terms of what happens when we lose that divide between people and nature. Like if we say it doesn't exist. People were wondering, what would ecology look like? And what would be possible if people are now considered part of nature?
And so we actually found someone who I think might be able to shed some light on that. We've got Zack Walsh, who's an ecological researcher and process philosopher. Zack, thank you for joining us. And I'm kind of curious, what is, I don't even know what that means. What does a process philosopher do?
They philosophize now
about the process.
Right. Just a joke. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. So process philosophy has antecedents in all different cultures. But most well-known of the process philosophers is Alfred Whitehead. And the basic idea behind process philosophy is philosophizing from the standpoint of more complex systems thinking and thinking in terms of processes and relations, as opposed to the sort of mainstream schools of philosophical thought today, which are based on objects as discrete, separable, material things that aren't necessarily in internal relationship with each other. So it's just a shift of understanding reality in terms of relationships, basically.
Okay, well, it's fascinating. I'm hoping we can keep the conversation today kind of in terms everyday people understand, not too philosophical,
Yeah.
but it should be interesting. So what are your thoughts about kind of this thing Ian's talking about, kind of the role of humans and the environment, and kind of are they separate things, or obviously we live on the planet Earth, we're part of the environment. What is your thinking around that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the shifts, to Ian's point, that happens when we consider ourselves as part of nature, which has always been the case, is that we take less of a management or control and instrumental based sort of approach to nature. So we're not trying to necessarily impose a particular way of dealing with nature outside of really understanding natural systems and life processes, and more trying to shepherd those into healthy ecosystems, healthy social systems. So if we're part of nature, right, we're really trying to listen to nature as opposed to just trying to sort of impose a particular intervention on nature. Okay, so it's a shift in understanding how am I related to nature, not just as something out there, as outside, as in green pastures or as in some idyllic romantic vision of nature, but actually as all around me. And that makes you understand that nature is both in urban spaces and rural spaces. It's sitting here with me in my home, not just in the plants that are on my desks, but also like the bacteria and the fungi that are inhabiting me in my body. Like ecology in this way is everywhere, and that we are all part of ecological systems in everyday life. So I think it's just a reorientation.
I have a question, Zach. So Iain, something that you said about decolonizing environmental thinking, I think that's a fascinating idea, and I hear about the concept of decolonization, specifically in the design space. I know that that's a big conversation right now, but within the environmental space, is there a point of view about specifically decolonization? Because I know that that's, it seems that that's something new to me. I don't know if that's a term that is currently used. I was asking Zach or Iain, whoever.
Zach, take it away.
Yeah.
So I thought that was to Iain. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as much work as there is to be done, like a term that's getting traction across all fields. So within ecology, there is a big push to understand, traditional ways of doing ecology, which is termed in the field like traditional ecological knowledge, which comes from indigenous perspectives. And let's just take an example of why this is so important. Like fire management, quote again, has become such a big thing. Trump has been talking about it as the wildfires have been raging in the West. A lot of the problems with modern traditional farm management is that it doesn't take into account how controlled burning, how indigenous sort of technologies and practices around fire management have actually helped to control burns so that they don't get out of hand, and so I think decolonizing ecology, that's just one example of so many, is really trying to reintegrate these other perspectives that are more in tune with life cycles, life processes, and trying to not control and manage, to my first point, the ecology, but to be part of it, to actually be a steward of the ecology.
What about just here on a local level in a place like Montclair? Like, what would you suggest for how people could kind of be more part of the everyday environment? Like, what steps could people take, or how should they approach environmentalism differently?
Yeah, great question. I mean, like, I would start with whatever your particular listeners are interested in, what, calls them, because there are as many opportunities as you can imagine. So if you're interested, like in farming, I know some of the earlier workshops you've done in the Montclair Design Week were around foraging and farming and food systems. And so there's a lot of really interesting work around regenerative agriculture, for instance, or agroecology or permaculture, that takes this more embedded perspective where the human is in nature, right, as opposed to controlling and managing from the outside. And so there are projects like urban garden projects, right, that you could be part of. There's projects like edible cities type projects where you can create gardens that are shared among neighbors, right? Like typically you see in neighborhoods also like community gardens. That's a way to understand how you're part of these life cycles, these life processes. You're giving back to nature at the same time that it's literally sustaining you, your life, and the neighbors around you, right? That's, again, one example. You could talk about like water systems and shepherding those. You could talk about alternative ways to retrofit your house. There are a lot of different opportunities in the realm of sustainability, but in each of those, there's also ones that are more invested in this relationship that I've talked to you about.
Could you mention, like, if on that sort of scale of more and less, what would be on that relationship? As it seems some of these ideas definitely fall into the old paradigm of separating and purifying rather than the entangling and shepherding. So what would you say is really something very local, practical, that's really about shepherding and entangling?
Yeah, so we haven't mentioned it, but I know that you're also, you had an interview with David Boley on the Commons and thinking a lot about the Commons. And I know later today you said you're having a session on participative budgeting. So I would name any kind of participative economy or participative economy that's interfacing with ecology as what you just described, because and the thing that comes first to mind, because you're in a more urban area, is a lot of these, not just citizen science initiatives, but like open source and crowdsourced initiatives that people map urban areas and locate different projects in those areas. So there could be like community gardens, there could be tool sheds, there could be different community resources, and they're just like on Google Maps, for instance. And people participate in a local economy, but in a way that's interfacing with also the local ecology to regenerate it, to both give life and to share the products of whatever they're participating in. So that runs a broad spectrum, but I think there are opportunities in community to participate and not just, again, think of like ecology as like, I got to leave the city and go on a hike, or think about economics as like the system out there, but actually there's so many opportunities where you can be a shepherd to your local environment, as you're saying, and create value that is shared really locally, really with your neighbors, with your friends. And there's digital tools now, especially, that make that really possible in real time.
We've got a question from Petya, who's watching us. She was asking, she said she's always fascinated by how we communicate complex and important ideas in a way that kind of people really get and understand. So how would you kind of take this kind of theoretical, like this kind of model, and translate it into like a media campaign or like something to kind of really get people active and involved and engaged?
In a media campaign,
or just some way to kind of take this model that just actually encourage people to understand that like the environment isn't just going on a hike out at Mills Reservation or something, but kind of in their daily lives, like doing more of their grocery shopping, I guess, at the farmer's market, or what do like actually taking small steps that they could take. And I don't know, maybe you might have some thoughts as well, Rich, because I know you've worked on kind of media campaigns for various places in the past as well.
Yeah, actually, yeah, just to add to that a little bit, I think for the idea of either simplification or localization of kind of like these larger ideas, like what's like a grassroots level approach, what can the individual do in the home, and how is that scalable on, like, I guess, on a city level too? Like what's that reverse scalability down to the individual for a lot of those really amazing ideas, Zach?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, I think to the last question, Rich, the stuff I was talking about that Iain's starting to bring into, I guess, the design week around participative processes, participative economics, budgeting, resourcing, is that sort of is often like a middle ground between individual citizens, groups of citizens, and like policymakers, what you traditionally think of like government as, because it creates a sense of like local autonomy and local control of resources, and an ability to also have freedom to design those projects or be part of those projects that are really innovative and engaging, and not sort of top down, but more bottom up, to your point, Rich. Yeah, so I would say that creating those groups and then interfacing with your local policymakers, with government, to sort of stake out some maybe resources to accomplish what you want. So like, let me give you an example. You said you're in New York. There's a really good example that I love out there. I think it's called like 99 Acres or something. And here's what they did. they realized at a certain point that there was a bunch of vacant lots and land that was unused, right? And they contacted their local city officials and they're like, well, who controls this land? They tried, first of all, the local city officials were supposed to be managing this land, but didn't even have a full inventory of where the land was, and so it just fell into mismanagement. And so they just became overgrown lots. So first there was this participative process within the community for mapping where all these vacant lots were. And then they requested from the city government, who was supposed to be managing the land, but didn't have the resources to actually create citizen sort of systems of controlling that. And then they formed groups, working groups, and then decided what did they want to do with that land. And so the government gave them permission to use that land for community gardens, for community meeting spaces, for cultural and arts-based projects. So that's just one example of like how to interface with government in a real practical way.
Hey, Zach, I have one last question where you introduced two really key terms, and we touched on one. You said, when we're no longer separate and we're part of it, we move from imposing and controlling to shepherding. But then you also said it's also about listening. And I think this brings up something Prakash was really talking about, that we've, our models of thinking about ecology and nature, we've already defined what species are. Some are considered wild and some are considered pests. Some are considered natural and some are considered invasive. And it feels like this listening part is really important, where you're thinking about what does this species do in this system versus how we pre-identified it and labeled it based on a pre-existing framework. So I'm wondering how you approach this concept of listening in that logic.
It's a big question, thank you. So ecosystems and just life in general is so complex. And so I think listening is the first thing all of us have to do, right? And I think the more we attune to life processes, the better we are able to shepherd, as you said, the sustainability of our lives and the lives of these ecosystems. So for me, I'll give a very different example, which might strike some as unusual. There are practices of sort of sonic meditation, for instance, or there are practices, contemplative-based practices for understanding your relationship to the environment around you. And this could take very practically the form of like walking in nature or hiking, but attuning to what's around you, right? And why does this matter? So another example is, well, if I'm listening while I'm hiking and I hear no birds virtually, right? That's a signal that something's not right. And actually that bird song is not just aesthetically pleasing to my ear, but it's actually a signal of an ecosystem that's not necessarily doing very well, okay? Now, you could listen in that way to so many other facets of the ecosystem and just approach it from this more humble perspective of what can I learn here before I enter into any kind of an interventionist approach.
Yeah.
To really understand how the different species in the area are cooperating with each other to create, right, these sustainable processes for giving life. So that's, yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, this has all been really fascinating. I'm afraid we have to move on here, but thank you so much, Zach, for joining us. This has been great. And thank you, Iain, for your interesting question. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next segment now. And for that, I'm going to first introduce Peter Iacobelis, who's a counselor at large for the Township of Montclair. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to actually ask a question that I hear from a lot of people around town all the time. I know you're a big proponent of local businesses, and I think I've heard you spend a lot of time walking through the streets meeting business owners. And the question I've heard, many people raise from time to time is, why are there so many vacant storefronts around Montclair? And what, if anything, could the town do about it? And obviously, it's a particular issue right now with COVID, but even before this, there were a lot in some places. So I'm wondering if this is, as a town councilor, if that's something you've looked into, and what your thoughts are in that.
Yeah, so thank you for having me, first of all, and hi, everybody. I hope Design Week is a huge success.
Yeah, thank you.
Certainly challenged by being virtual. I wish we could be in person, but I did see a note about a Sunday night party, socially distanced party that I might mosey on over to.
Yeah, you should totally come.
Yeah, so listen, it's definitely something that was top of mind for me even long before I ran for office. I worked for American Express on the Shop Small Business Saturday program. So I've really been interested in this idea of, just ensuring that we're protecting, what's special about our communities. I was in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania this week for a few days, actually canvassing for the Biden campaign. And what I noticed there is the same thing I've noticed in so many other places, and where my parents live in Delaware, it's the same thing. You go to downtown and you see all the legacy buildings in a legacy area that used to be the heart and the center of it, right? But then you drive 2 miles to a ring outside of it and you find the Starbucks, the Walmart, the Target, all the new, retail, right? So that's actually where my hotel was. I was looking out at Chick-fil-A and Starbucks and Walmart. And I was just thinking, and I've always thought this, how sad it is that when these companies want to open up, what they do is they build on the outskirts and not in the core of towns. And that, I think more importantly, consumers habitually have moved towards their shopping and procuring what they need from these larger big box retailers outside of our city center. So American Express always had this, well, not always, but for the last 11 years has had a pretty vibrant Shop Small program where they've been really trying to inspire locals to turn back inward, to procure the goods that you need and the services that you need from your own neighborhood. Dare we return to a time like when I was younger with my grandmother, where we would walk outside of our apartment with a shopping cart that we owned, one of those ones that you would unfold, and you would go, down to the main street in your store and get your goods, whether it was a hardware store, it was the tailor, it was the shoe store or the jewelry store, you procured things from your own area. So there's a fundamental shift that I think is needed in the mindset of consumers. And part of that is a willingness to spend a little bit more money to procure those goods, right? Because the small mom and pop businesses downtown don't have the ability to bulk discount things the same way chains do. And so, that's why everybody chooses to go to the big box stores, and the bigger, elephant in the room, obviously, being Amazon. So particular to Montclair, what we have is right now about a 20% vacancy rate downtown. Some of that's concerning and some of that's actually encouraging to me. So what I mean by that is, I think we are forced to be innovative and to think differently. And that actually excites me. We've got some legacy properties in terms of, like, for example, the Chase Bank that's on the corner of North Fulton and Bloomfield Avenue, which is vacant, which obviously contributes significantly to that square footage vacancy number of 20% overall. That is an example of a huge building with, only a municipal lot behind it, but not dedicated parking, surrounded by, smaller retail shops and restaurants. And it sort of just begs the question, what do you do with that? That's one example. Obviously, the Hampton House, on the corner just adjacent to, is another example of a, furniture store that was open only 2 years ago. They were still selling furniture. That's now gone vacant. The same thing. What do you do with that level of real estate? So my hope is that with multiple parking decks opening, one opening any day now next to the Seymour Street development, then the shovel will go on the ground for the Midtown parking deck, which is on Glenridge Avenue, which will be completed by next summer. By this time next year, maybe a few months earlier than this, we'll have a net increase of 800 new spots downtown. So that's going to help in terms of increasing demand. And wherever you stand on the issue of development in town, and specifically development downtown, and I know we have people that are all over the map on that, and there's definitely a conflict between protecting the charm and historic preservation and growth. There's always going to be that challenge and that conflict in Montclair. The good thing about it is you're adding 1,200 units, residential units in the core area of downtown, which means, you know, again, we don't know the numbers, but anywhere from 1 to 2 people. So let's say 1.5 people per unit on average. So you're adding over 1,000, possibly over 2,000 new residents just right there who can walk out of their buildings and frequent those. So my hope is that with increased parking and with increased residential, that those two things together will be really helpful in terms of driving demand. The demand has to be there in order for businesses who are thinking differently and innovatively about spaces to want to experiment with opening up there, right? So that's why we see so many businesses open and then fail, right? Because there's this trial and error. So that's really my hope.
Peter, I have a question. I think that's all amazing information. So it's twofold, really. What areas do you see in, like, outside of Montclair where foot traffic or storefronts, you know, that are a similar type of community, a similar community profile? Like, where is thriving in the foot traffic, also storefront space happening, and also within Montclair itself, what type of storefronts are succeeding, and, you know, where is there opportunity for investment on what is success right now?
Sure. So I think what we see successful, and this is something obviously that the folks at Design Shed and Design Week or Montclair Design were all sort of part of, was when we shut down Church Street, right? So what we heard from business owners immediately there, for most of them, some of them complained, but most of them were really happy and reported that their sales were through the roof in those times. So what we've seen is when we sort of shift the infrastructure to be a little bit more pedestrian friendly, you know, walk friendly, bike friendly, then you increase the volume of people who are going in and out of those businesses. You make it easier for people, you know, you essentially make it competitive with, I'm going to drive 10 minutes outside of Montclair because it's easier to park in a parking lot, right? People choose to go to other places, not just for cost, but also for ease of experience. So I think certainly the Church Street area is one area, and I'm encouraged by the redevelopment of Bloomfield Avenue overall, just in terms of, you know, we're going to get new lights and new turning signals and new lanes and just a whole new system with all of the traffic lights along Bloomfield Avenue in Montclair, you know, newly sequenced and timed to change in the right way. So a real redesign of traffic patterns and traffic flow through Montclair that I think will make it easier to navigate, especially dangerous intersections like the Five Corners where the tree is on Fullerton, Bloomfield, and Church. In terms of other areas that I think do it right, you know, what I see in New Jersey, I'm sure you all see this, and really I would say in the Northeast, you don't see this as much as you start to get into newer parts of the country that have more sprawl, right? In the legacy part of the country, really the 13 original colonies, you know, that have the infrastructure, that have more narrow streets. What you tend to see is when you have the combination of mass transit availability and some charm, some historical preservation, and good sort of transportation and infrastructure logistics to support that kind of economy, those areas thrive. But towns that have focused on making sure those pieces all work well together and don't live in isolation have done well. You know, you guys, I'm sure know, like, you just go to Delaware, to Pennsylvania, or anywhere, you'll see as you get further out from the sort of Northeast busy corridor, you know, communities are just being built from scratch, right? And there's no character, there's no charm. It's just sprawl. It's a Lowe's, it's a Walmart, and then it's a development of all beige houses that used to be in a cornfield. So, and those places may thrive in their own way, and they are in many cases. But if you're looking for, you know, what I looked for moving to Montclair, I want beautiful buildings and a thriving downtown and thriving local small businesses. And that can only be successful if you have a population that's willing to support that as well. But like I mentioned, the parking, the foot traffic, and the mass transit, and frankly, what I hope becomes more conscious of an issue for us in Montclair, cycling infrastructure to support it as well.
Right. Yeah, I'm really interested in some of these ways that, obviously we're talking about private businesses, but ways that the town can kind of encourage, you know, them and help out the business community. I wanted to actually bring in a second guest, Jaime Izarrieta, who's a storefront design consultant, or storefront ninja, as he likes to call himself. Thank you so much for joining us, Jaime. And I think you need to unmute your microphone there. Thank you. And so you've also spent a lot of time walking around the streets of town, and you have an idea that you think could help partially, solve a bit of this problem of vacant storefronts that I guess you wanted to present to Peter. Tell us a little bit about your thinking, what your idea was.
Yes, thank you. And happy to be here in Montclair Design Week. I'm actually an alum from last year, so very happy to be able to contribute. Yeah, I've walked the streets a lot. I work as a design consultant, and I consult with different downtown and Main Street organizations to harness the beauty of storefronts. So we have so many storefronts, so much creativity, so much passion of the business owners that goes into the storefronts, that their contributions to the sidewalk, as little as they may seem, when you add them up, they make fantastic cities. So this is the area where I'm working on. And yeah, so I walk the streets a lot, and then eventually I find some little storefronts that are abandoned. So you start to question the context that causes that abandonment, or causes that the vacancy, the high vacancy rates that Peter is referring to. And it's not only on bigger storefronts, but it's also in very small storefronts. And we sometimes count those vacancies in a matter of square footage. But maybe it would be great to count it in a matter of storefronts. How many, not a percentage of square footage, but how many, what the number of storefronts that are vacant. And that may give us a different map. It may give us a different way of looking at things. And one way of looking at things is looking at what kind of rules and regulations are producing these vacancies. So when you walk around Montclair, you will notice that there is no Walmart in Montclair, that there is no Target in Montclair, there is no huge big box retail in Montclair. This is because the rules of Montclair do not allow that. And that, I think, is good, because the dynamics of these large footprint stores are a little bit incompatible with the dynamics of a main street. That is exactly what Peter described before, that you can leave your apartment with your own shopping cart and go get everything you need in a 10 or 15 minute walking area, the pedestrian shed, which is what we call it. So yeah, I found some incredible storefronts around Montclair, mostly on Glenridge Avenue, which is particularly interesting because they're very close to Bay Street Station. So having all these great opportunities very close to where so many people gather together to take the train, one would think that many entrepreneurs would be super happy to occupy these places, yet they are not occupied, they are vacant. And even the buildings, they are not in top shape. So you start to wonder, you start to ask yourself, what is producing these vacancies? What is producing these things? And zoning is the answer. Zoning and land use regulations are incompatible, not here, but nationwide. They're incompatible with the human scale of the Main Street dynamics, which is very narrow storefronts that are occupied by apartments on the upper floors and would not necessarily retail, but non-residential uses on the ground floors. So they could be community uses. They could be, I don't know, the place where the youth orchestra rehearsals.
Jaime, I'm wondering if you could maybe show us some pictures of some of these places you're thinking of? Sure, just so we can get a sense of what you're talking about.
Okay, am I able to share the screen?
Let's see some design and Design Week.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Let me see. Oh.
I think, so you're basically talking about kind of tiny places that maybe have been abandoned for a long time and people were thinking, well, they're too small to really do much in. and you're kind of thinking outside the box and trying to figure out maybe there is some way that we could do something.
I'm trying to figure out how
yeah.
to...
Also, I have a question too, like while we're waiting. Oh, there we go. I can ask it after we talk to the visual.
What do you see now? Do you see
we see your website.
What do you see, the Google Maps?
No, we see a website you're on.
You see a website.
Are you on two screens?
No.
No.
I can't. Let me see.
Okay, I see where your mouse is. Sorry, we should have worked this out ahead of time. But anyway, why don't you, Rich? You want to while you're figuring that out, Rich, you want to ask your question?
Oh yeah, sure. So I have a question, like from a designer's perspective. So curious. You call yourself a storefront ninja, and I think that's an amazing role to have, especially within a community. And also, I've been thinking a lot about public spaces with COVID shutdowns and like what public visuals look like now, especially as we recontextualize what commercialism looks like in a public space in context with like larger initiatives. So if you're a new business owner in Montclair, what are some primary like no-brainer things that you would think about from when you're designing or thinking about what your storefront should look like? What are some first steps if they don't approach you? Like what should they be thinking about themselves, and also what's the level up in that space?
What is the sidewalk about? So when you look at your storefront, you're usually standing on the sidewalk and looking in. I would say stand inside and look out and see how much of your business can spill over to the sidewalk. And because businesses are essentially the buffer spaces between the private and the public. So when the business owners are successful in creating great buffers, it's very good for the city because the entire street becomes active and becomes attractive also. And it's also good for business because when the street is active, you can easily transform the foot traffic into footfall for your business. So yeah, I would say instead of just looking to your business, to your storefront in a void, look from your storefront outside and see how much you can share with the sidewalk, how much you can share with the triple bottom line, your business, your community, and your city.
I just wanted to get back to your idea, Jaime, so that we can't bring up the pictures, but some of these storefronts that you're talking about, these little tiny places up and down like Glen Ridge Avenue and other places throughout Montclair, like what are we talking about in terms of square footage? You have kind of a rough idea of how small they are?
Yeah, these are in the hundreds. I mean, it's very, very tiny.
So much smaller than a typical store you would see around Montclair.
It's, let's say if you have I don't know, 1,000 square foot storefront, which are super tiny, but they would accommodate small entrepreneurs that have very limited resources to start. And they can't, for example, if they have to pay, I don't know, $45, $50 per square foot, that is a lot of money for an entrepreneur that just has a great idea and has a lot of passion, but doesn't have much cash, So being able to look at these small places and being able to not be engaged in a months long process with the city to get a variance, to get a zoning change, or to get a conditional permit to use these storefronts would be fantastic.
So what describe the impediments that stand in the way right now of revitalizing these vacant storefronts in terms of the zoning or whatever from your standpoint?
Let me see if I can now show you the screen.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, we should have worked this out.
Yeah, sorry.
Before.
Okay.
I'm sorry about this.
Well, if not, we could just move on if we can't figure it out. But anyway, so basically the town would need to change some of the zoning requirements because right now what those spaces are too small to allow businesses, or they're in neighborhoods where oh, there we go. Yes, perfect.
Do you see a house?
Yes, there we do. Go.
All right, so this is 73 Glen Ridge, which is on Glen Ridge Avenue. And this is a very tiny storefront that is probably, I don't know, 12 to 15 feet wide. And you can see how deep it is. So it's probably not more than 20 or 30 feet deep. It's a very, very, very tiny storefront that has living accommodations or other accommodations, let's say, on the second floor. And you can see here, if you see my little arrow there, there's a separate entrance. So there's not even an entrance to the second floor from the storefront. And so this is very tiny. When you look at the context of why this might be vacant, you have to come here. You have to come here, and this is the Montclair zoning viewer. Do you see this?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So this is the corner of Glenridge and Cloverhill Place. And this here is the storefront that we are looking at. Okay. You see that the zoning for this is R2. And when we come to R2, we found some interesting things. So these are the permitted uses. So you can have a one family detached dwelling, you can have two family dwelling, or you can have municipal facilities. So there's no mention of any retail or any commercial or any small scale manufacturing or anything that might interest or might benefit an entrepreneur. There's some permitted conditional uses. So one of my friends, we were looking at this, one of my zoning expert friends, and he was saying, yeah, so you can start the church of retail, because as you can see, there's a permitted conditional use, which is church. Charitable institutions, except hospitals. So unfortunately, we cannot have a hospital there. And then some accessory uses. And then the lot size requirements, which are interesting, because the minimum lot width is 40 feet. So you can see the fundamental divide that the zoning code of the city has with the existing building stock of the city. And existing building stock that could be helping tremendously the small entrepreneurs that right now, I was just looking at a graph today, and new business applications for new businesses are up 150% from last year. This means that of so many people that have lost their jobs during these challenging times, what they are doing is they are turning into entrepreneurship. And Peter also mentioned the very high volatility rate of these small businesses. Many are dead within 1 year because they are, I mean, you have to test them out. Sometimes they don't work. And if you have to make a very, very costly bet, because you need to be in a legal fight with the city for 9 months until you get a variance to establish your church of ice cream in this small storefront, that drains your resources. And if you are right now counting your pennies and you find these small places where you can set up your church of ice cream, but you can't, so that kind of stifles the whole thing. So we are supporting the small businesses because we are going and we are purchasing from them. But I mean, one purchase or two purchases from a small business helps, but having the capacity for many entrepreneurs go into these places would be fantastic.
Okay, I think we need to, I want to get Peter's response because I know we're running a little bit over and I don't know how much time everyone has. But Peter, kind of what it seems like the way Jaime's presenting this, it looks like a lot of the challenge with a lot of these vacant storefronts, I mean, they're very tiny, but they're also maybe in residential neighborhoods or places that might not be zoned for people to have little businesses. What are your thoughts about all this? And would you be open to, like, the city looking into ways to possibly change the zoning to get something happening in these storefronts once again?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, that first of all, that looks like it could be a retail store to me, or it could be a salon or a barber shop or something, right? So I think absolutely case by case, we should look at these. Where you start to get into trouble is where you start to talk about changing, wholesale an R1 zone, for example. People start to get really nervous that you're going to introduce a lot of commercial and traffic and whatnot. But in a case like this, like, to me, this is clearly designed for not to be a residential, right? Residential above, but storefront for some sort of commercial or private use with the intention of people coming in and out and having to park on the street. Like, so if it's a church or if it's a salon or if it's something else, like, that's going to be the same sort of volume and people coming through it. Regardless, it's not just a residential building and you're not just going to have the same people coming in and out of that door all the time. you're going to have varied people coming in and out, which is some of the motivation, I think, behind some of the zoning in town. But look, absolutely, we should look at on a case-by-case basis where there are applications for interesting uses of places like this, because rather than it sit empty like this, why not have something interesting go in the space? I live actually right around the corner, so I'm familiar with the building you're showing. That's actually across from Senior Citizen Home, Pine Ridge.
And there's another one right there he's showing us.
Yeah.
A few examples like this up and down the street. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so look, I think, what I was going to say sort of more broadly is there's change happening for downtown Montclair. We're moving in the direction of, I'm really excited about Seymour Street being a closed pedestrian plaza. We're going to be expanding the sidewalk on Glen Ridge from Bloomfield Avenue down to, well, I'm not sure how far it's going to go down, but down at least a street or two where it'll be extended, widened by another 4 feet. So in front of Dolly Moo and all those shops, you'll have even more expanded space for things like outdoor dining or planters or whatever you want to do to sort of beautify the space overall. So I'm encouraged by that. But look, I think if the question is, how can we get government bureaucracy out of the way to allow innovation to take hold? Let's figure it out. I'm absolutely open to that conversation anytime. And I do think we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. I believe that. You have to be conscious of what the residents around the area want for that space and balance that with the broader interests of the town. But let's do it.
We've got, before we wrap up, we've got a question. Someone was asking, could we begin talks to implement a storefront improvements grant program in Montclair? What do you think of that idea, Peter?
I don't know what that means. So, I mean, I could deduce from the verbiage what it means, storefront improvements grants program. I would have to understand what that means a little bit more. Like, what are we talking about these specific examples that Jaime was showing? Just in terms of like a redevelopment plan or fund for downtrodden areas?
I'm thinking it's something like what they have in Philadelphia, where business owners can apply for small grants to revitalize their storefronts. So in Philadelphia, of course, it's a much larger context, but I think they have grants, like $15,000 grants that business owners can apply to change the entire storefront. But I don't quote me on that. I know they have the program. I don't know how much the grants are for.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, I would need to just see a little bit more detail about it to weigh in. But the idea of creating an incentive to turn around places that are not utilized at all or that are neighborhood blight, I'm absolutely in support of that. I don't know that it can come from local township funds, but I know that there are plenty of mechanisms throughout county, state, federal, private, just all sorts of entities that look for things like that, especially if you're talking about, helping, minority and women-owned businesses to get off the ground. There's sometimes ways that you can check multiple boxes at the same time, right? In that particular area where you're showing, Jaime, too, like, seniors in those homes right there will tell you, how desperate they are to have access to fresh food. So, something where we could turn a space like that into just a simple produce market, like that's something where there's a real community need for it. And the council could take action to kind of cut through your bureaucracy. But I want to say, I don't think, bureaucracy sort of works in and against us in many ways, right? And I do want to highlight sometimes the value of it, and that I am proud of and happy with the power that Historic Preservation Commission has in town, right? So sometimes things are slowed down because everything has to ultimately go through some of these bodies. But in Montclair, we have a very vibrant and active Historic Preservation Commission that we've given new powers recently in terms of demolition authority. So nothing can be demolished in town now without going through HPC. And that may take time, but I'm willing to let that take a little bit of time, because that means, to me, we're being really careful about making sure we don't tear down any beautiful historic structures and put something ugly in place of it, and preserving the character of town. So I do think it's a balance. But when there is something that I think is really interesting to do, or a really clear example of something that we can do, we certainly as a council can figure out how to cut through some of that unnecessary, proverbial red tape, as they call it.
Yeah, Petya was commenting that some other surrounding areas like Newark, Maplewood, and South Orange, even New York City, have their own like economic development offices, and so they give grants specifically for things like this. That might be one idea to consider. Yeah.
So look, we have to zoom out. There's a bigger need. So Montclair does not have an economic development office or department or operation of any kind. It's very there's isolated components of different individuals' job descriptions, but there is no central entity in Montclair. It's a big gaping need, and we need to be leveraging something like that, and to bring talent into to support work like that, to do the things that we're discussing here, but also things like drive visitation to Montclair, look for just diversifying the businesses that we have. I think an economic development committee or an economic development department could very much be tasked with their sole responsibility can be flipping these storefronts around and pulling in, finding essentially, it could be the job to find the match for the place, right? Like their job is to go out there and sort of solicit, right? It's almost like a request for proposal. Yeah. Like, here's this space, here's what we're willing to do in terms of a government to make it easier for you to use this space. Who's interested? You kind of
That's really cool. Yeah, that would be really cool.
Actually,
Sure.
Oh, wait, sorry.
No,
yeah,
go ahead.
sure. Thanks, Scott. So I have a question to follow up to that point, Peter. So if there's the idea of submitting proposals, as well as if there's a smaller scale of what these storefronts could be, are there some easy, or layup is probably the wrong word, but are there some layup businesses that would be either fast tracked or would end up be prioritizing by virtue of the town favoring them because of bureaucracy? Or if I wanted to write a proposal this weekend, what would I find success with?
I think there has to be a conversation around community support first, right? So it's not just how the council or the government feels, but it's making sure the time is taken to see how the people feel and the residents particularly around it. I do think things can be fast tracked, especially when there's a really obvious use case for it with strong demand from the community, when it's almost universal and we realize everyone's on board, everyone has this priority, and the only thing in our way is bureaucratic red tape and complicated processes. So there certainly is the power to cut through some of that stuff, but in a way that still protects the integrity and the necessity of it. I've had to learn to live with government bureaucracy in a lot of ways, and sometimes it's really bad and sometimes it's really good, and it's just trying to find that balance, but remembering that a lot of it exists, and the intention behind it is to force us to take a step back and just consider more perspectives and the bigger picture, but that should never be an excuse to let things go too long.
Gotcha. I mean, what I meant, or I guess the deeper conversation about that, what would that be a coffee shop, or would that be a tarot reading space? What could I do from an immediate level, from a concept space? Would it be a bike shop? What could those things be?
Yeah, so if we're talking about the Fourth Ward, for example, while we wait, for a decade to get a grocery store at Lackawanna Plaza, we know that it's a significant issue. There's a food desert. I hear from seniors and people who live in I live in the Fourth Ward, but people who just live all over, that access to food is a real problem. It's 2 miles to get to the nearest grocery store for a lot of residents. So that's, to me, an example where if somebody came to me with a proposal for, not just me, by the way, or other government bodies, and came to us with a proposal for 2 storefronts or 3 or whatever it was, to put in a produce market to give people in the Fourth Ward access to fresh produce and food, I think we would move mountains to make that happen. So it's hard for me to say, I can't see us doing that for a bike shop, or for it doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen, but I think something like that, or a coffee shop, would go through the normal process. But if it's flagged and a couple council members are really interested in making it happen, again, we can have some influence in prioritizing.
Well, this has all been really fascinating. And I love the idea, as you mentioned, Peter, of if the town were to play some kind of role as a matchmaker, looking at spaces and looking at businesses. And particularly, you know, Jaime, a lot of these places that you're pointing out are in more residential neighborhoods. And so having like a little corner store or something, I think that makes kind of our vision of the vision a lot of us have of kind of a more walkable community, where you don't need to get in your car and drive somewhere. You could just hop down to the corner, pick up a few groceries or whatever it is you need. I think it's a really cool idea. So I think this is really exciting. So thank you so much for presenting your idea, Jaime. Thank you, Peter, for being a sounding board for all of this, and for all of you for being so generous with your time. Sorry, this went on a bit long, but I think this is a really fascinating conversation. And I think this is the kind of conversations we were hoping to have during Design Week.
Definitely.
So
Keep it going.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
And I just have to say, so glad to have this kind of brain trust in Montclair, because we need it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Adds to the richness and the character. So
yeah,
keep the ideas coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you being a part of it. So thanks to both of you. And thank you, Rich, for joining me. I really appreciate it. I think this was an interesting conversation. You got any final thoughts or anything?
No, well, first of all, thank you, Scott, for having me. This has been super fun. Probably my best meeting of today. So I appreciate you for having me here, and also be able to, have visibility to, the amazing design conversations happening in Montclair and also New Jersey. I love it. I hope to do it again, and also, hope to have a great conversation with you again soon.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you so much for everyone. We really appreciate you joining us each day this week. And these conversations will be archived on our YouTube channel, I think in about a week or so. I think if you just stay tuned to our social media and designshed.org, we'll probably post
can I,
about that.
If I could plug my, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I forgot to do the plug.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, so if you want to find me, Rich2, on social media, just at Rich_TU on Instagram, and also I have a website with some cool design. If any of y'all like to check that stuff out, rich2.com. And also I do host my own podcast about inclusion within the creative space, called specifically within the immigrant community. It's called First Generation Burden. It's on iTunes or Apple Podcasts and Spotify and anywhere you get your podcast content. So thank you for having me again.
Thank you. And while we're doing it, my podcast is called Far From Home. And I tell stories from around the world when I'm able to travel. So thank you very much, all of you, for tuning in. And we will just follow us on social media, designshed.org, and all the usual places. And check out, we have a few more events coming up this week as part of Montclair Design Week, including there's a dance party this evening, socially distant dance party, and our final closing party with a bunch of fire pits and locally foraged food coming up on Sunday evening. So check out our website for all of that. Thanks all of you for watching.